There is a word that every person in Britain knows. It crackles through train stations and hospital corridors and school assembly halls. It came over the Tannoy. But almost nobody alive can tell you that Tannoy was a company, a real factory in an ex-iron town outside Glasgow called Coatbridge, where Scottish craftsmen hand-built the loudspeakers that recorded Dark Side of the Moon and sat behind Churchill's head on VE Day. Then a conglomerate bought the company, promised those workers a brand new £3 million Scottish factory, and sent the work to a mega plant in Guangdong instead. No architect's drawing was ever released. No ground was ever broken. Today, the Coatbridge building sits empty beside the M8. No plaque, no memorial, 69,000 square feet of silence. This is the story of Guy Fountain, a Yorkshire tinkerer who put his word into the English language, and how 90 years of Scottish craft was undone when the people who promised to protect it chose not to. Not through one catastrophe, through a promise made in public and abandoned in silence. Chapter 1. The Yorkshireman and the Butcher's Daughter. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with a man nobody expected to change anything. Guy Rupert Fountain was born in 1898 in Selby, a small North Yorkshire market town in the shadow of its medieval abbey. No school records survive in the public domain. No university attended. No apprenticeship papers filed. Everything we know about his early life suggests an autodidact, a practical engineer who learned the way practical engineers have always learned, by taking things apart and putting them back together again, usually in a shed. What pushed him south isn't entirely clear. The best single biography, Julian Alderton's The Tannoy Story, published by Edward Gaskell in 2004, says he came to London during the First World War, and an anecdote attributed to the same book places him briefly in the army, where he befriended a young man called Walter Portwine. That friendship, whether it was forged in barracks or in civilian London, would change the course of British audio. Walter's father was John Portwine, born in 1862. On the surface, Portwine was a London butcher, a man who'd grown rich from the wartime meat trade, supplying cuts to a city under pressure. But Portwine was considerably more than a butcher. In 1902, together with the Weller brothers, he'd co-founded the company that became AC Cars, one of the pioneering British automobile marques, later famous for the AC Cobra and its explosive legal war with Carroll Shelby. John Portwine knew engineering. He knew Brooklands. He knew the smell of machine oil and the sound of an engine being pushed beyond its design limits. He was, in the terminology of the day, a man of enterprise, and he had a daughter. Elsie Portwine married Guy Fountain in 1922. The Portwines installed their daughter and new son-in-law first at 25 Lancaster Road, and later at 112 College Road, Dulwich, a handsome Edwardian house that Portwine himself had built. The Yorkshireman from the Abbey town had married into London money and London engineering. That mattered enormously, because he used both. Fountain set up a commercial garage on Tulsamere Road, just south of the Portwine home, in the parish boundary where Dulwich shades into West Norwood. The garage did what every garage in the 1920s did. Fixed cars, sold petrol and, as a sideline, charged the lead-acid accumulators that powered the new wireless sets arriving in every middle-class parlour after the BBC started broadcasting in November 1922. That sideline is where everything starts. To understand why, you have to understand what early radio actually demanded of its listeners. The wireless sets of the 1920s were battery monsters. Each thermionic valve required two separate electrical supplies, a low-voltage current to heat its filament and a high-voltage current to drive its anode. The low-voltage job was handled by lead-acid accumulators, heavy, corrosive glass jars filled with sulfuric acid. Every few weeks, the man of the house would trudge down to his local garage with the accumulator sloshing at his side, pay a few pence, and wait while it was refilled with charge. It was, for the wireless enthusiast, the least glamorous part of the most glamorous new technology on Earth. Fountain, tinkering in the back room of his Tulsamere Road garage, asked the question that every good engineer asks: why should anyone have to do this? Mains electricity was arriving in every London street. The infrastructure was there. Why not build a device the wireless owner could plug into his own wall socket, cut the garage out of the loop entirely, and charge his own batteries at home? The problem was rectification. A home charger needs to convert alternating current from the mains into the direct current that batteries require. The best available rectifiers in 1925 were mercury vapor bulbs, expensive, fragile, and disconcertingly lethal if mishandled. Fountain wanted something tougher, something a middle-class householder wouldn't be afraid to plug in next to the aspidistra. He built an electrolytic rectifier using a pair of dissimilar metal electrodes sitting in a liquid electrolyte. The choice of metals mattered enormously. The cathode had to be a so-called valve metal, one that would form a stable oxide film on its surface, passing current in one direction and blocking it in the other. The anode had to survive prolonged immersion without dissolving. Fountain settled, after experiment, on two specific elements: tantalum and a lead alloy, tan T-L-Um, A-L-L-O-Y, merged them together, Tannoy. It wasn't a flourish of marketing. It wasn't cooked up in an agency office. It was a portmanteau of the chemistry, a label for the materials inside the box, adopted as a trade name around 1928 and stamped on every rectifier that left the Tulsamere Road workshop. The Oxford English Dictionary dates its earliest evidence to the Trademarks Journal of that year. Fountain founded the business in 1926 under the name Tulsamere Manufacturing Company. By the end of the decade, the Tannoy name had overtaken the company name on the product. On March 10, 1932, he formally re-registered the company as Guy R. Fountain Limited, with the Tannoy trademark secured. And then he did something that seemed, at the time, like a quirk of personality. He insisted, over what his biographer described as a lot of opposition, that the name Tannoy appear prominently on every single piece of equipment the company supplied. Every box, every grill, every unit. The fretwork letters T-A-N-N-O-Y cut into metal and screwed to the front panel. That single decision, a tinkerer's obsession with branding pressed against the resistance of his own colleagues, is why the word entered the English language. Chapter 2. Tantalum to trumpets. By 1930, the rectifier business that had made Fountain's name was already dying. Mains-powered all-electric radios were replacing battery sets across Britain. The very technology Fountain had tried to serve, home battery charging, was being leapfrogged by sets that didn't need batteries at all. The market he'd built on was collapsing under him before the factory paint was dry. A lesser man might have clung on, squeezing the last pennies from a shrinking trade. Fountain pivoted. His engineers had been experimenting, almost as a side project, with moving coil loudspeakers. These were DC-energized designs, a field coil wound around a soft iron pole piece, drawing current from the same kind of rectifier that powered the rest of the wireless set. The physics was common knowledge among audio engineers. What was uncommon was Fountain's willingness to throw his entire operation at it, abandoning the product line that had given his company its name in favor of one that was already dominated by much larger firms. The competitive landscape was daunting. Marconi and Western Electric, both of them vast, well-funded, internationally connected, were already established in the public address business. Their equipment filled cinemas and permanent stadium installations, but Tannoy's own company history, preserved by the UK Hi-Fi History Society, is blunt about what Fountain saw. Large companies such as Marconi and Western Electric were already in the public address business, but their equipment was not flexible enough to cater for mobile and portable applications in circuses and fairs. That was the gap. Marconi did the Odeon Leicester Square. Western Electric did Wembley Stadium. Nobody at all, was serving the travelling showman. The circus impresario who needed a ring of horns round a big top that would be in a different field next week. The racecourse bookmaker who needed to call the odds across a grandstand. The factory foreman who needed to address 500 workers across a munitions floor without bursting a blood vessel. The political candidate who needed to reach the back of a crowd on a wet Tuesday in Wolverhampton. Fountain built for all of them. The breakthrough came in 1930, when Tannoy won a contract to supply Bertram Mills Circus, the most famous travelling circus in Europe, wintering at Olympia and touring the country every summer, with a complete sound reinforcement system. The technical constraints were brutal. The valve amplifiers of the day were powered by noisy motor generators and rotary converters, not by clean mains supplies. The cabinets had to be robust enough to survive weeks of bouncing along English B roads in the back of a lorry. They had to be loud enough to compete with elephants, ringmasters, and the cheering of 5,000 spectators in a canvas tent. They were. and the contract made Tannoy's name in the trade. Within 2 years, Fountain's catalogue had expanded from rectifiers into a complete public address ecosystem. Microphones, loudspeakers, amplifiers from 10 to 200 watts output, portable systems that could be erected in an hour and struck in half that time. By 1933, the company had produced its first discrete two-way loudspeaker system, separate drivers for bass and treble frequencies, in a single enclosure. By 1934, the product range included in-house test and measurement equipment so precise that even Gilbert Briggs, the Yorkshire founder of Wharfdale Loudspeakers, made use of Tannoy's laboratory to calibrate his own cones. 2 Yorkshire audio men, 30 years apart in age, sharing a test bench in West Norwood. The industry was still small enough for that, and Fountain wasn't working in isolation. A remarkable audio engineering cluster had grown up across South London in the 1920s and 1930s, one of those localised concentrations of talent that British industry has always excelled at producing, and then, just as reliably, failed to protect. 3 miles from Tulsamere Road, in Sydenham, Paul G.A.H. Voigt, a Dulwich College and UCL graduate, BSc, 1922, one of the most gifted acoustic engineers of his generation, was filing his celebrated Tractrix horn patents. At the Crystal Palace, John Logie Baird was experimenting with television until the Great Fire of 1936 destroyed his studios. In Peckham, Edison Bell was pressing gramophone records until it collapsed in 1933. Fountain, according to the Norwood Society's local history records, used Voigt's laboratory facilities in the early days, an extraordinary collaboration between 2 men who would define British horn loudspeaker design. Voigt the theorist, Fountain the industrialist. One man who could calculate the ideal flare rate of a horn from first principles, another who could turn that calculation into a product that would survive being bolted to a circus tent pole in a rainstorm. By 1937, Tannoy had outgrown the Tulsamere Road garage and its subsequent Dalton Road workshop. Fountain moved the entire operation to Canterbury Grove, West Norwood, a proper factory with dedicated production floors, test facilities, and the capacity to build at the scale the market now demanded. The stationery of the day described the company, with characteristic British understatement, as acoustic engineers and manufacturers of sound amplifying equipment. It was the eve of war, and war would do for Tannoy what no advertising campaign in history has ever done for anyone. Chapter 3. The Word That Won the War. When war came in September 1939, Guy Fountain converted his entire Canterbury Grove factory to defence work. The UK Hi-Fi History Society's company history records the transition in a single, comprehensive sentence. All the Tannoy facilities were concentrated on the nation's defence programme. Communication systems for airfields, crew communication for submarines and tanks, command systems for gun batteries and systems for the defence industries were developed and put into production. That clinical summary conceals a transformation. Within months, Tannoy PA systems were aboard Royal Navy warships, relaying battle orders between bridge and gun turret. They were inside the hulls of tanks, giving commanders a voice above the engine roar. They were on the taxiways of RAF Fighter Command airfields, guiding Spitfires and Hurricanes to their dispersal points. They were in the gun batteries of the south coast, coordinating anti-aircraft fire during the Blitz. And they were in the munitions factories, the vast wartime sheds where millions of women assembled shells and cartridges, broadcasting the BBC's Music While You Work, the twice-daily half-hour concert programme designed to keep productivity high and spirits higher. In every one of these settings, the Tannoy equipment carried those distinctive fretwork letters on its grille. Fountain's pre-war obsession, the insistence, against his colleagues' objections, that every unit bear the brand name prominently, now paid a dividend nobody could have predicted. Because Tannoy loudspeakers also stood on every public platform from which Winston Churchill spoke. Think about what that meant. Throughout 6 years of wartime newsreels, shown in cinemas across the country before every feature film, watched by audiences of tens of millions, the word Tannoy hovered behind the Prime Minister's head as he roared defiance into a microphone. It was visible on the speakers at factory rallies, at troop parades, at the victory celebrations. On VE Day, May 8, 1945, a Tannoy PA system was installed in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace to broadcast the announcement of peace to the crowds massed below. The word was there, on the grille, at the moment the war ended. No paid advertising campaign has ever done as much for a brand. The commercial logic was almost accidental. Fountain hadn't designed his speakers to be photographed. He'd designed them to be heard, but the result was that by 1945, the word tannoy had become synonymous in the British mind with any loudspeaker through which an authoritative voice spoke. In railway stations, in hospitals, in schools, in airports. The word slipped its moorings and drifted out into the common tongue. The Oxford English Dictionary dates its earliest trademark evidence to 1928 and records the word entering common usage as both a noun and a verb through the 1940s and 1950s. By 1986, the OED's main entry was formally published, recognising what every Briton already knew. Tannoy had joined that tiny club of trade names, Hoover, Biro, Sellotape, Thermos, Escalator, that had escaped the trademark register and become the language itself. The company fought back for decades. Its intellectual property department wrote to publications. Private Eye was a noted recipient, insisting on the capital T and the trademark symbol. But the battle was already lost. The word belonged to everyone. The company had become a ghost inside its own brand name. That is the paradox that runs through this entire story. Tannoy is the most successful British manufacturer you've never heard of, and what makes that paradox sharper is what happened immediately after the war, when a quiet engineer in Fountain's workshop produced one of the most elegant pieces of acoustic engineering the 20th century would ever see. Chapter 4. Rackham's Beautiful Move. His name was Ronald H. Rackham. He was Tannoy's chief engineer, a modest figure who had served the company for more than 40 years, and whose contribution to audio history is inversely proportional to the amount the public knows about him. Almost nothing survives in the open record about his personal life. No birth date, no photograph widely circulated, no published interview. He is one of those British engineers whose work speaks so loudly that nobody thought to record the man behind it. In 1947, in the workshops at Canterbury Grove, Rackham solved a problem that had plagued loudspeaker designers since the first two-way systems appeared in the early 1930s. The problem was this. A conventional two-way loudspeaker mounts a large bass driver, typically a cone of 12 or 15 inches, below a smaller treble driver, or tweeter. Each driver handles its own frequency range. The arrangement works, but it carries a fundamental acoustic flaw. Because the two drivers occupy different physical locations, the sound waves they produce arrive at the listener's ear at slightly different times. At the crossover frequency, the point where one driver hands over to the other, the phase errors produce comb filtering, time smearing, and an off-axis coloration that no amount of crossover design can fully eliminate. The sound is coming from two places at once. The ear knows it. It isn't natural. Rackham's solution was a single, beautiful move. Instead of mounting the tweeter above the woofer, he mounted a small 2-inch compression driver behind the bass cone, firing forward through a horn whose final flare was formed by the bass cone itself. The two drivers shared a single cast alloy magnet assembly with twin air gaps, the bass cone's motor on the outer ring, the compression driver's motor in the center. The high-frequency sound emerged from the exact geometric center of the bass cone, traveling along the same axis, arriving at the listener's ear from a single coincident point in space. He called it the Dual Concentric. Acoustically, the result was something loudspeaker engineers had theorized about, but never achieved at production scale. A genuine point source, a loudspeaker that radiated sound from a single location across its full frequency range, with coherent phase response, integrated dispersion, and a tonal neutrality that made everything else on the market sound like a compromise. The bass cone and the compression horn weren't fighting each other. They were collaborating. Two transducers sharing a magnet, sharing an axis, sharing a single acoustic origin. It was launched publicly at the 1947 London radio show, initially positioned not as a hi-fi product, but as a precision transducer for microphone calibration, a reference tool for engineers who needed to know exactly what their recordings sounded like. The music industry was listening. Arthur Haddy, the chief recording engineer at Decca Records, heard the Dual Concentric in 1951 and ordered the first 6 units for Decca's full-frequency range recording studios, the FFRR program, that was then pushing the boundaries of what a vinyl disc could reproduce. Dr. Dutton of EMAE heard them and specified monitor silver drivers in GRF enclosures for Abbey Road studios. Kingsway Hall, where Decca recorded its orchestral sessions, installed them. The BBC followed. What happened next was a lineage that vintage audio collectors today recite the way wine enthusiasts recite vintages, each iteration carrying a colour name, each one slightly different in character, each one now a collector's object in its own right. The Monitor Black came first, in 1947. Black hammer-tone chassis, 20 watts handling, 15 ohms impedance, the original. The Monitor Silver followed in 1953. Silver-painted chassis, 25 watts, the bestseller. The one that ended up in more studios and more audiophile living rooms than any other variant. The Monitor Red arrived in 1958. Darker hammer-tone finish, pink-red magnet covers, and for the first time, a 10-inch near-field variant alongside the 15-inch reference. The Monitor Gold appeared in 1967, grey chassis with gold plastic magnet covers, higher power handling, refined crossover. The studio standard of the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it was the Monitor Gold that wrote Tannoy into the history of recorded music in a way that can never be erased. In late 1968, Abbey Road Studio 2 replaced its American Alltech 605A monitors with Lancaster cabinets fitted with Tannoy Monitor Gold 15-inch Dual Concentrics. The Alltechs had served well, the Tannoys served better, and for the next 5 years, every significant record made in that room was mixed through them, including, between May 1972 and February 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon. Alan Parsons sat at the desk, the Lockwood cabinets hung in the wall above him, Roger Waters' bass, David Gilmour's guitar, Nick Mason's drums, Richard Wright's keyboards, all of it passed through Rackham's Dual Concentric on its way to becoming the third best-selling album of all time. Pete Townshend used Monitor Golds in his home studio. Vangelis composed the Blade Runner soundtrack on Tannoy Dreadnought monitors in 1982. The Rolling Stones mixed through them. Led Zeppelin mixed through them. The Clash mixed through them. When British rock and British classical both chose the same British loudspeaker to hear themselves on, the golden age had arrived. But the year the Dual Concentric debuted publicly was also, almost certainly, the year Guy Fountain came within days of losing everything. Grace's Guide to British Industrial History carries one stark line in its Tannoy chronology for 1948. Winding up order against Guy R. Fountain Limited. The Norwood Society's review of the Alderton biography confirms it. His company had its ups and downs, at one time going into receivership for a while. The year of the masterpiece was also the year of the near-death. The company recovered, reorganized, re-registered, pressed forward with the driver that would save it. But the receivership is a detail the official corporate timelines never mention. It adds a useful note of fragility to the legend. The Golden Age wasn't inevitable. It was, like most Golden Ages, a near miss. Chapter 5. The Ironburgh. Guy Rupert Fountain retired in 1974, aged 76. He'd run the company for 48 years. He died in 1977. There was no family succession. His son, Michael Fountain, still alive and recently interviewed on the Hi-Fi Hanger YouTube channel, did not take over the firm. Instead, in 1974, Tannoy passed to Harman International Industries, the American audio conglomerate, founded by Sidney Harman. And Harman, within 2 years, made a decision that would define the next half-century of the company's story. It moved Tannoy to Scotland. In 1976, Harman relocated Tannoy's entire production operation from Canterbury Grove in West Norwood to a purpose-built facility on the Rose Hall Industrial Estate, Coatbridge, Lanarkshire. The address, 10 Palace-Craig Street, postcode ML54TF, would be the company's home for the next 45 years. The move was strategic, and it was regional. The Scottish Development Agency had been established in 1975 with the express mission of attracting manufacturing into a Scotland that was bleeding jobs from its collapsing heavy industries. Regional selective assistance grants were on offer. Labour was cheaper than in London. Industrial land was available at a fraction of the Norwood price. For a company that needed production space and a skilled manual workforce, central Scotland in the mid-1970s was the obvious destination. But there's a deeper poetry to the choice, and it matters for understanding what Tannoy would become in Coatbridge, because Coatbridge was not a blank canvas. It was a town that had already been shaped and scarred by a century and a half of the heaviest industry Britain had ever known. Coatbridge, in 1976, had been a cluster of hamlets until two transformations turned it into one of the furnaces of the British Empire. The first was James Beaumont Nielsen's hot blast smelting process, patented in 1828, which dramatically reduced the amount of coal needed to produce pig iron and opened up Scotland's Blackband ironstone deposits to profitable extraction. The second was the Monkland Canal, completed in 1793, which gave the area a direct water route to Glasgow and the Clyde. Together, they created an inferno. William Baird and Company's Gartcherry Ironworks, founded in 1830, was the first purpose-built works to use the hot blast process. By 1843, it had 16 blast furnaces arrayed in 2 rows on either side of a canal branch, producing roughly 100,000 tons of pig iron a year, probably the largest pig iron output in the world. A government inspector, writing in 1840, described the town at night. Blazing volcanoes. Smelting continued on Sundays and weekdays, by day and by night, without intermission. By the 1850s, Coatbridge contained nearly half of Scotland's blast furnaces. The nickname that would last forever was coined the Ironburgh. That industry died slowly and ingloriously. Summerley Ironworks closed in 1932 and was demolished in 1938. Gartcherry merged, was nationalised, and finally shut down in the post-war consolidation. By 1976, Coatbridge had become what so many British industrial towns became in the second half of the 20th century, a place whose entire identity had been built by factories that were no longer there. The iron was gone, the furnaces were gone, the skills were still there. 3 generations of machinists and cabinet makers and fitters and engineers looking for somewhere to put their hands. Into that town, Harman dropped one of the most sophisticated acoustic engineering operations in Europe, and for 40 years, it worked. The hands that had once shaped iron would now shape sound. The precision that had calibrated blast furnaces would calibrate crossover networks. The pride that had built an empire's infrastructure would build the loudspeakers that recorded an era's music. The HPD, High Power driver was launched the same year as the move, in 1974, carrying the Dual Concentric principle into a new generation with foam surrounds and reinforced cones. It was the first driver designed specifically for the Coatbridge era. More would follow, many more. But before the golden age of the Scottish factory can be told, the story of what happened to Tannoy's ownership after Harman needs tracing, because it was a game of musical chairs, and every time the music stopped, the Coatbridge factory was one step closer to the moment it would go dark. In 1977, Harman International was swallowed by Beatrice Foods, the Chicago conglomerate, a company better known for dairy products and baked beans than for audio engineering. Tannoy went with it, part of a job lot. By 1981, with the early 1980s British hi-fi recession biting hard, Beatrice decided to divest. Tannoy's working directors bought the company out. For the first time in its history, it was owned by the people who ran it. That management buyout was the beginning of the most ambitious chapter in Tannoy's commercial life. In 1986 and 1987, the company merged with Goodman's Loudspeakers to form TGI plc, Tannoy Goodman's International, described at the time as the largest audio equipment company in Britain. Mordaunt Short joined. Later, Epos, Creek, Martin Audio, and Sweden's Lab.Gruppen came under the same roof. In 1988, TGI floated on the London Stock Exchange, reportedly the first company to do so after the Black Monday crash of October 1987. The Prestige range, named after English and Scottish cathedral cities and landscapes, in a piece of branding that tied acoustic engineering to national heritage. Canterbury, Westminster, Stirling, Edinburgh, Kensington, Turnberry, Glenair, swept Japan's Golden Sound Awards. The Westminster had won in 1982. It would win again with the system 215 in 1990. Japan's obsession with Tannoy deserves a word, because it became one of the quiet pillars of the company's commercial survival. The Prestige speakers found their natural home in the tatami-matted listening rooms of Tokyo collectors, who would pay 4 million yen or more for a used pair of monitor golds. Listeners for whom the warmth and musicality of Rackham's point-source design represented something no solid-state Japanese electronics could replicate. A specialist Japanese distributor, Esoteric, published its own Tannoy catalogue. When the Kingdom Royal launched in 2011, its first consignment sold almost entirely into Japan. This matters because it establishes a fact the later story will destroy. At its peak, Tannoy was not a declining company. It was not a heritage curiosity trading on nostalgia. It was an iconic, profitable, award-winning, globally exported operation whose market in Japan and across Asia was among the strongest of any British audio manufacturer. The Coatbridge factory wasn't making museum pieces. It was making products the world's most demanding listeners were queuing to buy. The summit was high. The fall would be proportionate. Chapter 6. The Cathedral on Palace Street. At its peak, the Coatbridge factory covered close to 70,000 square feet across a 4.5-acre site on Palace Street, flanked by the Rose Hall Industrial Estate on one side and the M8 Motorways Junction 7 on the other. A 2-story brick office block fronted the street. Behind it stretched a single-span industrial shed, a low-slung rectangle of corrugated cladding and steel framing that could have been a warehouse, a logistics hub, a vehicle depot. From the outside, nothing about the building announced what was happening within it. That was part of the character. The best British manufacturing has always looked, from the road, like something you'd drive past without a second glance. Inside was a different world. A visitor walking through the main entrance would have passed first through the office reception, carpet tiles, framed photographs of prestige speakers, a modest display cabinet holding a monitor gold driver, and then through a set of double doors into the production floor, where the air changed. The first thing was the smell. Birch plywood has a particular scent when it's being cut and routed at scale, clean, dry, faintly sweet, somewhere between sawdust and vanilla. Underneath it, the richer, darker smell of walnut, real walnut, in sheets and planks stacked vertically in racks against the wall, waiting to be sliced into veneer leaves, sorted by grain and matched by hand before being laid up on the cabinet panels. And underneath both of those, the sharper chemical notes of French polish, linseed oil, lacquer thinners, and the solder flux drifting from the crossover assembly benches further down the floor. The sound was constant but layered. The overhead router, a CNC machine that cut baffle apertures, port tubes, and rebates into pre-cut birch panels, produced a high, continuous whine that became the factory's baseline note, the pitch your ear adjusted to within 5 minutes and forgot about within 10. Beneath it, the rhythmic thump hiss of the veneer press closing and opening, bonding thin leaves of walnut to the plywood substrate with heat and pressure. Then the quieter sounds. The click of a crossover board being clipped into a test jig, the low sub-bass murmur of a driver being run in on an acoustic test bench, and, always in the background, Radio Scotland playing faintly from a shelf-mounted transistor radio that nobody had turned off since approximately 1983. The workflow moved, roughly, from the back of the shed to the front. Raw birch plywood arrived in full sheets, 18mm Baltic birch, sourced for its consistency, its density, and its freedom from internal voids that could rattle or resonate when a 15-inch driver was pushing serious air. The sheets were cut to panel dimensions on a table saw, then routed to shape on the CNC. Rebates for drivers, apertures for binding posts, channels for internal wiring. Each cut programmed to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, because a prestige cabinet isn't just a box. It's an acoustic enclosure, whose internal volume, panel stiffness, and port tuning are calculated to work with a specific driver in a specific alignment. Get the volume wrong by half a litre, and the bass response shifts. Get the baffle thickness wrong by a millimetre, and the driver mounting changes the seal. The precision mattered. From the CNC, the panels moved to the veneer department. This was where the factory's character declared itself most clearly, because veneering a prestige cabinet was not a mechanical process. It was a craft. A Westminster Royal GR cabinet, the flagship of the range, weighing around 140 kilograms when fully assembled, was finished in oiled real walnut with solid walnut mouldings and burr walnut inlays. The veneer specialist's job was to read the grain of a walnut log, select leaves that matched in figure and colour, lay them up in symmetrical book-matched pairs on each panel, and ensure that the grain flowed consistently around the cabinet's edges so that a pair of Westminsters, standing side by side in a customer's listening room, looked as though they'd been carved from a single tree. The leaves were thin, typically less than a millimetre, and they were fragile. They had to be dampened, positioned and fed into the veneer press with the care of a bookbinder handling vellum. The press itself was a large heated platen that applied even heat and even pressure across the full surface of the panel, bonding the veneer to the substrate through a layer of adhesive. The timing mattered. Too little time and the bond would fail. Too much and the veneer would darken or crack. The temperature mattered. The moisture content of the wood mattered. The veneer specialist knew all of this, not from a manual, but from 20 years of watching walnut respond to heat and pressure and adjusting by feel. From the veneer press, the panels moved to the assembly benches, where they were glued, clamped and squared into cabinets. Corner joints were reinforced. Internal bracing, calculated to control panel resonance, was fitted. The interiors were lined with acoustic wadding. Grille frames were built and covered with fabric. Solid walnut mouldings were cut, mitered, stained and fitted to the cabinet's edges and base. Each moulding was sanded by hand to a finish that, under the lacquer, felt like stone polished by water. At the other end of the production floor, a parallel workflow was producing the thing that went inside the cabinet. The dual concentric driver assembly was the heart of the operation. Paper pulp cones, not injection-molded plastic, not pressed aluminium, but formed paper pulp, stiffened with kapok fibre, were fitted to twin-roll impregnated fabric surrounds. The voice coils, 52mm edge-wound copper on Captain formers, were hand-wound on a jig, checked for resistance and concentricity, and bonded to the cone assembly. The compression driver that formed the high-frequency section used an aluminium-magnesium alloy dome, mounted behind the cone's geometric centre, firing forward through a machined horn flare. On the top of the range models, the magnet system was Alnico, an alloy of aluminium, nickel and cobalt that produces a magnetic field with a character audio engineers describe as organic, warm and musically coherent, though what they really mean is that it sounds like nothing else on Earth. The crossover networks, the electronic circuits that divide the audio signal between the base cone and the compression driver, were another declaration of intent. On the Prestige range, crossovers were hardwired by hand on heavy boards using ICW Clarity Cap MR capacitors, low-loss laminated core inductors, silver-plated cable, and high silver content solar. The wiring was routed with the tidiness of a surgeon's suture. No excess, no mess. Every joint reflowed to a bright, smooth dome. And then, in a step that separated Coatbridge from virtually every other loudspeaker factory on Earth, the entire crossover assembly was passed through a deep cryogenic treatment chamber. Cryogenic treatment involved cooling the assembled board to minus 190 degrees Celsius, the temperature of liquid nitrogen, and holding it there for a controlled period before bringing it slowly back to room temperature. The process stress relieves the metal lattice of the conductors and solder joints, reducing microcrystalline boundaries that can introduce subtle distortions at the signal level. Whether the audible improvement is real or placebo has been debated in audio forums for decades. What isn't debated is that Tannoy did it, consistently, as a standard production step, at significant cost, because they believed it mattered. The cryogenic chamber was one of the Coatbridge factory's signature details, a piece of laboratory equipment sitting in a production shed in an ex-iron town in Lanarkshire, doing something that most of the industry considered unnecessary and that Tannoy considered essential. Chapter 7. The names on the certificate. Each finished loudspeaker that left Palace-Craig Street carried a signed quality certificate, a small slip of paper tucked inside the cabinet alongside the owner's manual and a miniature tin of Tannoy's own Prestige wood wax, documenting sign-off at every stage. Cabinet inspection, grille inspection, driver assembly, crossover assembly, final acoustic test with the high-power switch engaged. Each stage signed by name, not a production number. A name. A person stood behind every speaker that went out the door. We know some of those names, though fewer than we should. Dr. Paul Mills was Tannoy's Director of Research and Engineering for Domestic Products, a 27-year veteran of the company, the man who led the Kingdom Royal Development Programme through the 2010 and who understood the dual concentric's behaviour at the level of the electromagnetic field equations that governed it. Mills was the senior technical intelligence in the building, the person who could tell you not just what a driver was doing, but why and what would happen if you changed any single parameter by a fraction. Tim Lount was Vice President of Sales and Marketing, also a 27-year man, the public voice of the Prestige range and the person who knew, better than anyone in the industry, what the Japanese market wanted and what the European audiophile expected. Lount had walked the floor of every major audio show from Munich to Tokyo to Las Vegas, and he carried Tannoy's story in his head the way a diplomat carries his country's history. Not just the dates and the products, but the texture, the relationships, the rivalries, the private judgments about what worked and what didn't. Gabriel O'Donoghue was operations director, the man who turned engineering drawings into production reality, who managed the supply chain, the tooling, the scheduling, the daily logistics of turning birch plywood and copper wire and walnut veneer into finished loudspeakers that could be packed, palletized and shipped to distributors in 40 countries. Stuart Wilkinson was product development director, the bridge between what Mills designed and what O'Donoghue built, the person whose job was to ensure that what looked right on a specification sheet could actually be manufactured at the quality and cost the market demanded. And behind these senior names, the people whose names appear in a single photograph published by Positive Feedback magazine, listing the Kingdom Royal project team: Harry Backer, John Grimmerson, James Harkness, Merrill Saunders, John Smith, Matthew Phelan, Anze Sosna. 9 people. 1 speaker. Hundreds of hours. These were the Coatbridge craftsmen, cabinet builders who could read walnut grain the way a typographer reads letter forms, veneer specialists whose hands had learned the moisture content of a sheet of figured walnut before the moisture meter confirmed it, crossover technicians who knew which solder to use on which capacitor lead to ensure the cryogenic treatment would take correctly, driver winders who could set the concentricity of a 52mm voice coil by feel, verifying by measurement what their fingers already knew, quality control engineers who could listen to a finished speaker playing a test signal and tell, from the sound alone, whether a fault was present that a spectrum analyzer might take another 10 seconds to detect. The ear, trained over decades, was faster than the machine. We have no long-form oral history of the Coatbridge factory in the public record. That is a scandal in itself. These were not anonymous production line operators feeding components into a machine. They were artisans whose skills took years to develop and could not be replicated by someone reading an instruction manual in a different country. And almost none of their voices were recorded while the factory was still running. The industrial history of Britain is littered with these absences. The workforce dismissed before anyone thought to ask them what they knew. The craft dispersed before anyone thought to document it. By the time someone reaches for the tape recorder, the people who could have told the story are retired or moved away, or dead. The Coatbridge workers aren't dead yet. Many are in their 50s and 60s. The documentary should state this as a call to action. Before the last generation of Tannoy's Scottish craftsmen passes, someone needs to sit down with them and record what they knew. Nobody else will do it. Chapter 8. The World Outside the Walls. What the Coatbridge factory meant beyond Palace Craig Street can be measured in several ways, but the simplest is to look at who was buying what they made and what they were paying for it. By the 2010s, the Prestige GR, gold reference, range had been refreshed with what the company described as revolutionary dual concentric technology. The lineup ran from the Autograph Mini GR, a compact stand mount, through the Turnberry GR, the Stirling GR, the Kensington GR, and the Canterbury GR, all the way up to the Westminster Royal GR, the flagship, the summit of the range, the speaker that defined what Coatbridge could do when every constraint except quality was removed. The Westminster Royal GR was not a product for the casual buyer. It stood nearly 4 feet tall. It weighed, as noted, approximately 140 kilograms per cabinet. Its cabinet work alone, the matched burr walnut inlays, the solid walnut mouldings, the hand-finished lacquer, represented weeks of labour. Its crossover used components whose individual cost exceeded the retail price of many competing loudspeakers. Its dual concentric driver, descended in direct lineage from Rackham's 1947 original, was assembled by hand in a process that hadn't fundamentally changed in 6 decades because the process didn't need changing. It worked. The price, by the late 2010s, was north of $35,000 a pair, climbing towards $50,000. The Kingdom Royal, launched in 2011 as the ultimate expression of the dual concentric principle, listed at well over $100,000. These were not volume products. They were, in the precise sense of the word, bespoke. Each pair built to order, each pair tested individually, each pair signed off by the people who made it. And Japan kept buying. The specialist distributor Esoteric published its own Tannoy catalogues, printed on heavy art paper, with the reverence that Japanese design culture brings to any object it considers worthy of extended contemplation. Tokyo showrooms displayed Westminsters in hushed, temperature-controlled environments. The speakers treated not as consumer electronics, but as instruments, objects whose value lay not in their specification sheets, but in the accumulated craft knowledge of the people who'd built them. At auction, original 1960s monitor gold units were already changing hands for several million yen. The appetite was deep, consistent, and growing. The export market extended well beyond Japan. Tannoy's professional division supplied studios, live-sound venues, and houses of worship across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The installed sound business, fixed PA systems for churches, conference centers, schools, had been the company's bread and butter since the Bertram Mills days, and it remained profitable. Martin Audio, which had been part of the TGI Group before being sold off to the TC Group's successor, had been a separate world-class brand in the professional live sound market. The Tannoy name, in professional audio circles, still carried a weight of credibility that no amount of marketing could replicate because it wasn't built on marketing. It was built on 40 years of speakers that worked, in rooms where the engineers who chose them had their reputations at stake every time they pressed record. The competitors who had fallen around Tannoy made the Coatbridge factory's survival all the more remarkable. Wharfdale, Gilbert Briggs's company, the one that had used Tannoy's own lab to calibrate its cones in the 1930s, was sold to Rank in 1958, and eventually, in 1997, to the Chinese-owned International Audio Group, whose manufacturing was based in Jian, Jiangxi Province. Quad, Peter Walker's legendary company, followed in 1995, and then to IAG in 1997. Mission went the same way in 2005. Leek, once one of the great names of British amplifier design, was revived in 2020 as a Chinese-manufactured brand. Celestion was bought by Hong Kong's Gold Peak in 1992 and moved most production east, though its heritage guitar speakers, the Alnico Blue, the G12H30 Heritage, remained proudly made in England at its Ipswich works. KF, under Gold Peak since 1992, at least retained its flagship blade and reference production in Maidstone, Kent. Bowers and Wilkins, now owned by the American firm Massimo, still built its 800 series diamond loudspeakers at Worthing, the jewel in the crown of remaining British speaker manufacturing. Rega, Naim, and Lynn remained independently British-made, but the full list of British loudspeaker companies that still built most of their product in Britain by the 2000s was shorter than anyone in the industry cared to admit. Coatbridge was on that list, one of the last, and the people on Palace-Craig Street knew it. Chapter 9. The Summit. The year to fix in mind is 2011. That was when the Kingdom Royal launched. Tannoy's most ambitious domestic loudspeaker, the culmination of the dual concentric principle taken to its absolute technical limit. Dr. Paul Mills had led the development. The Kingdom Royal project team, Barker, Lount, Grimmerson, Harkness, Saunders, Smith, Mills, Phelan, Sosner, had spent years refining the design, testing prototypes in the Coatbridge listening room, adjusting crossover topology, experimenting with cabinet geometry, pushing the Alnico magnet system to extract every last degree of musical truth from a driver architecture that was, by then, 64 years old and still ahead of most of the competition. The first production run sold almost entirely into Japan. Reviews were rapturous. The audiophile press, stereophile, hi-fi news, the Japanese specialist journals treated the Kingdom Royal not as a product launch, but as a statement of principle, that a small Scottish factory, with a workforce you could fit into a single coach, could still produce a loudspeaker that stood comparison with anything made anywhere in the world. The Prestige GR range, refreshed in 2013, was selling steadily. The Westminster Royal GR continued to win Golden Sound Awards. The export market was stable. The professional division was generating revenue. The company was owned by TC Group, the Danish audio firm founded by the Rishoy brothers, who had acquired TGI in January 2002 for approximately £14.8 million and had, on balance, been good custodians. Investment had continued. The factory management had been left largely alone. The The Kingdom Royal existed because TC Group hadn't interfered with the engineers. Tannoy, standing on that summit in 2013, looked as secure as any specialist British manufacturer could look in the 21st century. It had a globally recognised brand. It had a product range that stretched from affordable studio monitors to six-figure flagship loudspeakers. It had a loyal and technically brilliant workforce. It had a factory that, while not new, was functional, well-equipped, and capable of producing work that no other facility on Earth could replicate. It had a Japanese export market that showed no signs of weakening. What it also had, though nobody on Palace Craig Street could have known it, was a clock running down. In September 2014, TC Group announced it was for sale. The Danish business newspaper Børsen estimated the asking price could reach 1 billion Danish kroner, roughly £150 million. Anders Fagerskov, TC Group's CEO, told ProSound News that, "We do not intend this process to go on for a prolonged time period." He expected a sale to complete by spring 2015. The sale closed in April 2015. The buyer was a company called Music Group. The man behind it was Uli Behringer. And on that day, though the workers at Palace Craig Street didn't yet know it, the clock stopped. Everything that followed was aftermath. Chapter 10. The Man from Baden. To understand what happened to Tannoy after April 2015, you have to understand the man who bought it. Not as a caricature, the industry had already supplied plenty of those, but as a figure whose biography explains his methods. Uli Behringer was born on April 14, 1961 in Baden, Switzerland, a prosperous commuter town west of Zurich, nestled in the crook of the Limmat River, with a medieval old town and a tradition of precision engineering that runs back centuries. His father was a church organist and nuclear physicist. His mother was a pianist and interpreter. The household was cultured, comfortable, and steeped in music. Behringer began piano at 4. He had a classically trained ear, and at 16, in a bedroom in Baden, he built his first synthesizer, a modular unit he called the UB1, soldered together with the same practical instinct that had driven Guy Fountain to build a rectifier in a Dulwich garage half a century earlier. In 1982, Behringer moved to Düsseldorf to study classical piano at the Robert Schumann Conservatory and sound engineering at the Fachhochschule. On 25 January 1989, he founded Behringer Spezielle Studiotechnik GmbH in Villach, Germany. The company name was functional. The business model was not subtle. Take an established, expensive piece of professional audio equipment, study it, reverse engineer it, produce a functional equivalent at a fraction of the price, sell it to the musicians and engineers who couldn't afford the original. Behringer's public framing was that this democratized music technology, that a bedroom producer in Lagos or Lahore deserved access to the same tools as a studio in Los Angeles. His competitors, and increasingly the courts, described it differently. The legal trail is long, and it is specific. In June 1997, Mackie Designs of Seattle filed suit in the U.S. District Court against Behringer, Samson Technologies, and Sam Ash Music, alleging trademark, trade dress, copyright, and patent infringement over Behringer's MX-8000 mixing console, which Mackie said was a direct copy of its 8-bus console. Place the two side by side, and the resemblance was, to the untrained eye, indistinguishable. Mackie sought $109 million in damages, trebled to $327 million. The case ran for 2.5 years. In November 1999, the court dismissed Mackie's copyright claim on a controversial technicality. Circuit board schematics, the judge ruled, are not copyrightable under US law. Mackie largely lost. Behringer continued making the console. Before the Mackie case, Afex Systems had sued Behringer over a clone of its oral exciter Type F and won 690,000 Deutschmarks. In 2005, Roland sued over clones of Boss guitar pedals. The case settled confidentially in 2006, and Behringer quietly altered the designs. In 2009, PV Electronics filed 2 separate suits. In February 2006, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission fined Behringer $1 million because 50 of its products had not passed FCC emissions testing, and in 2017 and 2018, Behringer sued Dave Smith Instruments and 20 individual users of the Geerslutz Audio Forum for $250,000 in damages for defamation. The suit was dismissed by the Superior Court of California as a slap. a strategic lawsuit against public participation, a form of legal action whose primary purpose, in the court's assessment, was intimidation rather than the pursuit of a legitimate grievance. In March 2020, Behringer's company posted a mock video targeting the audio journalist Peter Kern, the Kern cork sniffer clip, which was widely condemned for featuring what critics described as anti-Semitic imagery. Behringer's Facebook statement called it pure satire by our marketing department. The apology was deleted the following day. None of this was secret. All of it was publicly documented, debated on forums, reported in trade press, and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. It was the public record of the man who, in April 2015, signed a contract in Riskov, Denmark, to acquire TC Group, and with it, Tannoy. In 1990, Behringer had shifted production from West Germany to mainland China to cut costs. By 1997, he'd relocated himself personally to Hong Kong. In 2002, he completed Behringer City, a 1.2 million square foot manufacturing complex in Zhongshan, Guangdong Province. By December 2017, when Music Group rebranded as Music Tribe with headquarters in Makati City, Metro Manila, the operation had scattered itself across the globe. Manufacturing in Zhongshan, R&D in Bangalore, customer support in the US, a holding company in the UAE. Its 12-brand portfolio now included Behringer, Midas, Clark Technic, Turbosound, Lab.Gruppen, TC Electronic, TC Helicon, Aston Microphones, and Tannoy. The acquisition statement, issued on the 30th of April 2015, was warm, reassuring, and ambitious. Behringer's own words. Throughout our search, TC Group has clearly stood out as the ideal match because of their world-class brands, impressive intellectual property, sterling reputation, and first-class team of people. I am very proud to welcome the TC Group team into our family. He added a specific commitment. We will invest heavily in positioning TC Group's brands at the very pinnacle of the industry, as we have done with Midas, Clark Technic, and Turbosound, where we have invested over $100 million in highly automated and integrated manufacturing facilities, quality control systems, and engineering resources, including a new Centre of Engineering Excellence in Manchester, UK. Anders Fawerskov offered the departing CEO's traditional cadence. We have selected Music Group as they represent the perfect fit in terms of strategic direction, overall synergies, and company culture. Company culture. The words sit in the air like smoke. Chapter 11. The Letter. The Coatbridge workers learned what Music Group's company culture meant on or around 29th April 2016, almost exactly 1 year after the acquisition. The communication came from Peter Summer, Music Group's Senior Vice President for Lifestyle and Home. Summer was a former Bang & Olufsen and Bowers and Wilkins executive, a man whose CV suggested he understood premium audio and the craft traditions that sustained it. His message was corporate, polite, and terminal. Following an extensive evaluation of our operational and financial structure, we have taken the difficult decision to propose that the staff in our Tannoy manufacturing and office facility in Coatbridge are dismissed as redundant, which, if confirmed, would see the facility closed. Approximately 70 people received that message. 70 workers, cabinet builders, veneer specialists, driver assemblers, crossover technicians, quality control engineers, administrative staff, whose combined experience represented the better part of 2,000 years of loudspeaker manufacturing knowledge. 70 people in a town where the iron furnaces had already gone, where the steelworks had already gone, where the pattern of industrial loss was so deeply grooved into the community's memory that each new closure felt less like news and more like geology. Music Group's public statement filled in the commercial logic. Tannoy production would be transferred to Music Group's new 3 million square foot manufacturing facility in Zhongshan, China, due to open in June 2016, and eventually housing up to 10,000 workers. R&D and marketing would relocate to Music Group's Innovation Centre in Manchester. Behringer himself, speaking to What Hi-Fi, put the case more bluntly. Tannoy Scotland is losing substantial money, a situation that is simply not sustainable and hence the steps we had to undertake. But we will be massively investing in Tannoy and especially our large R&D centre in Manchester. For years, Tannoy has not seen any investment in technology and is clearly lagging behind companies such as KAF and Bowers and Wilkins. We are absolutely determined to change this. A music group spokeswoman added one further detail. Behringer was planning to keep manufacturing of the prestige range in Europe, although not necessarily in the UK. Poland was reportedly one option, not necessarily in the UK. After 40 years of Scottish manufacturing, after walnut and birch and alnico and cryogenic chambers, after Kingdom Royals and Westminsters and Canterbury GRs, after signed quality certificates and tins of prestige woodwax, the country that made the loudspeakers had become, in the mouth of the multinational owner, a variable, a line item, a cost to be optimised. The reaction was immediate. Scottish newspapers ran the story on front pages and editorial columns. What Hi-Fi? Published an editorial. GMB Scotland mobilised its organisers. The Coatbridge factory, which had operated for 4 decades in relative public obscurity, known to audiophiles, invisible to the general press, became, overnight, a cause célèbre. Another Scottish factory on the chopping block, another multinational making promises with one hand and reaching for the axe with the other. And then, in September 2016, something unexpected happened. Behringer reversed. Chapter 12. The Promise. The new position, announced in September 2016, was this. Tannoy would not shut. The Coatbridge plant would close, yes, but only because it would be replaced by a new purpose-built factory elsewhere in Scotland. Strathclyde Business Park was the location most frequently mentioned in contemporary reporting. The new facility, music group said, would include substantial investment in innovation and production, as well as a museum and showroom for the brand's 90-year heritage. Behringer's own statement, issued to the trade press, was expansive. We are excited about the future of Tannoy, and we believe we have developed a sound strategic direction to protect its rich history and heritage. Tannoy was facing great economic pressures, and we believe that our plan will ensure the longevity of the brand. We are planning to relocate manufacturing to a new plant in Scotland, which will deliver modernised and streamlined operations, while continuing our involvement in local communities, providing employment in the region. This will secure Tannoy to remain a serious competitor in the high-end residential marketplace. He went further. Since the acquisition of the famous UK audio companies Midas, Clark Technic and Turbosound, we have hired close to 150 new engineers and other staff in the UK, which demonstrates our commitment to the country. A figure of £3 million circulated in the local Scottish press and in union briefings, the reported investment for the new Scottish plant. The specific number traces most reliably to GMB Scotland's internal briefings and the Airdrie and Coatbridge Advertiser archive, rather than to any single primary music group press release. But the broader commitment, a new factory in Scotland, preserving jobs and heritage, was unambiguously on the public record. It was quoted. It was reported. It was received by the 70 workers on Pallascraig Street as a reprieve. For a few months, hope held. The workers continued building loudspeakers. The crossover boards continued going through the cryogenic chamber. The veneer press continued closing and opening. Radio Scotland continued playing from the shelf. And then the hope began to curdle. By late 2016, the workers were noticing things. Senior managers at the Coatbridge plant were being placed on gardening leave. Company jargon for being told not to come to work while your redundancy paperwork was being processed. Email access was being blocked. Internal questions about the new factory's timeline, its location, its floor plans, its start date, questions any workforce would ask when they'd been promised a move, were going unanswered. Or rather, they were being answered, but not by anyone in Scotland. They were being rerouted to what the GMB Scotland organiser would bitterly describe as an HQ call centre in Manila. On 22nd December 2016, GMB Scotland issued a press release. It was headlined, "Come Clean for Christmas." Its author was Uli Behringer, GMB Scotland organiser, a man who had spent months trying to extract concrete commitments from a company whose decision-making centre was now 12 time zones away. Behringer's statement is worth dwelling on, because it captures the texture of what was happening better than any corporate press release could. Uli Behringer has been leading his workers and the media up the garden path over his real intentions for Tannoy's Scottish operations. The self-styled chief disruptor is stonewalling his employees, and instead of addressing their concerns, demoralised workers now have to forward questions concerning their futures to an HQ call centre in Manila. With local management having been effectively routed by Behringer, it looks like the Coatbridge plant is simply being run down ahead of March with no real prospect of a new site. The least he can do for this highly skilled and loyal workforce is to come clean for Christmas. Behind the rhetoric, Adigwe revealed the timeline that told the real story. Workers were being urged to sign individual redundancy settlements by Friday 13th January 2017. The Coatbridge site was scheduled to close on 31st March 2017. The new Scottish plant, the one that had been announced 5 months earlier to national press coverage, the one that was supposed to represent substantial investment and modernised operations, had not, in those 5 months, broken ground. No architect's drawings had been released, no site had been formally acquired, no planning application had been submitted. The promise existed in press releases and nowhere else. Chapter 13. The Guitar Player and the Empty Chamber. Into this fight, a famous voice stepped. On February 7th, 2017, Pete Townshend of The Who had used monitor gold drivers in his own home studio for decades, who had heard his own guitar through Rackham's Dual Concentric more times than any human could count, wrote a letter to Richard Leonard MSP, the Scottish Labour Economy spokesman for the Central Scotland region. The letter was published in The Scotsman. Townshend wrote, "I have used Tannoy speakers all my life in the recording studio. Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, The Clash. We all use Tannoys to make our records that 50 years later still generate income and kudos for the UK. The threatened closure," he said, "concerns me greatly, and the quality of the product will inevitably suffer without the skill and experience of the local workers." He finished with a direct pledge of support. "I am happy to support the workforce in the campaign to keep the Tannoy tradition of long-established excellence alive. We need to retain production and development in the hands of the experienced and proven Coatbridge workforce." Leonard's reply was a political rallying cry. Pete Townshend knows it is the quality of the workmanship, the experience that comes with applying those skills, and the constant innovation built on tradition and know-how, which makes the speakers made in Coatbridge so successful. It is a real boost in our campaign to retain these jobs to have Pete's support. Leonard fought. He raised the Tannoy issue in Holyrood repeatedly. He wrote to Scottish Enterprise. He rallied trade union voices. He was, in the public record, the workers' champion. But the broader political response was quieter than it should have been. Fulton McGregor, the SNP-MSP for Coatbridge and Criston, elected in May 2016, the very month the closure was first proposed, left little public trace on the Tannoy question. No substantive, on-the-record quotes on the fight surfaced in targeted research. The local incumbent did not, on the available evidence, make the plant his signature cause. Hugh Gaffney, elected Labour MP for Coatbridge, Criston and Bellshill in June 2017, equally produced little on-the-record Tannoy advocacy. The Scottish Government's Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Jobs and Fair Work during the critical 2016 to 2018 period was Keith Brown, MSP, replaced in June 2018 by Derek Mackay, MSP. No record of a formal government intervention, emergency summit, public investment offer, ministerial task force could be located in research. No white paper, no emergency debate, no ministerial visit to the factory gates. The contrast with previous Scottish industrial closures cuts deep. When Ravenscraig Steelworks closed in 1992, it produced government commissions, parliamentary time, ministerial promises. Ravenscraig employed thousands. Tannoy employed 70. But the principle was the same. A workforce being asked to surrender its livelihood because a foreign owner had decided that its skills were surplus to requirements, and the political response was not the same, not remotely. The Scottish political class did not save Tannoy. It did not, on the public record, try very hard. And the workers, 70 of them at the end, their names largely unrecorded in the press, went down without the cavalry. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles from Coatbridge, the facility that would replace them was taking shape. Music Tribe City was completed in 2018 in the Nanlang district of Zhongshan, Guangdong province. It was a fully integrated manufacturing campus of roughly 300,000 square meters, 3 million square feet. It employed approximately 3,000 workers, formerly referred to in Music Tribe's corporate communications as tribers. It had dormitories for up to 10,000. On its site were a supermarket, a bakery, a laundry service, a canteen, a hospital, and recreation facilities. It was a factory town, a 21st century company town, a self-contained industrial settlement that, in its scale and its paternalism and its distance from anything resembling a normal civic life, was reminiscent of nothing so much as Coatbridge itself in 1843, when the blast furnaces burned through the night and the iron masters housed their workers in rows. It was also, from almost the moment it opened, a site of labour unrest. In 2018, workers at Music Tribe City went on strike. The immediate trigger, reported by the Chinese audio technology publication MIDIFAN, and partially confirmed by Guangdong Public Channel Television, was a leukemia diagnosis in an engineer who had recently transferred to the new facility. Rumours spread that the factory's heir was responsible. Chinese television reported that half the workers felt dizzy after entering the new building and were not allowed to open windows. The environmental testing equipment's approval had, the broadcaster said, expired. The testing company's qualifications had been revoked. Behringer reportedly emailed staff, "Please keep office window closed." He stated independently that tests for formaldehyde and other hazardous materials had returned negative results. Midifan was subsequently served with a cease and desist letter from lawyers representing Uli Behringer, Music Tribe Global Brands Limited, Zhongshan Behringer Electronic Company Limited, and Zhongshan Uki Electronic Company Limited. A later and unrelated strike, documented by the China Labour Bulletin, involved more than 1,100 workers at Zhongshan Eurotech Electronics Company Limited, one of Music Tribe's local subsidiaries. The trigger was a new security screening procedure that forced workers to queue outside in record-breaking rain with only 2 metal detectors. Workers reported that wages had not risen for more than 5 years, averaging 3,000 to 4,000 yuan a month, roughly $550. Temporary workers were often paid more than permanent staff. Year-end bonuses had gone unpaid. A management letter alleged sabotage. Termination threats were issued over loudspeakers. The comparison need not be laboured. On one side of the world, 70 highly skilled Scottish craftsmen, cabinet builders, veneer specialists, driver winders, crossover soldierers, each of them a guardian of 8 decades of accumulated knowledge, had been made redundant. On the other side, thousands of low-paid workers were assembling products that carried the same name in a facility whose labour relations made national Chinese television. Chapter 14. The Lights Go Out. The promised new Scottish factory never materialised. No ground was broken. No architect's drawing was ever released. No site was formally acquired. No planning application was ever submitted. The promise, made publicly, reported nationally, received by 70 workers as a reprieve from redundancy, evaporated without a single concrete step being taken towards its fulfilment. The original Coatbridge plant limped on with a diminishing workforce through 2017, 2018, 2019, producing a shrinking range, each year a little quieter, a little emptier, a little closer to the end. In 2017, a core group of Tannoy's most senior engineers did what engineers do when they can see the wall approaching. They walked out and started again. Dr. Paul Mills, the 27-year veteran and Director of Research and Engineering, was the technical lead. With him came Gabriel O'Donoghue, the Operations Director, and Stuart Wilkinson, the Product Development Director. A founding team of around 7 people carrying, between them, more than 2 centuries of loudspeaker engineering experience. They called the new company Fine Audio. Fine was funded by a combination of overseas investors and, with a bitter irony, that the documentary should not let pass unremarked, Scottish Enterprise, the same Scottish government-linked development body that had failed to intervene meaningfully when Tannoy itself was being dismantled. By 2024, Fine had opened a purpose-built 50,000 square foot factory in Glasgow, with over 20,000 square feet of manufacturing space, an in-house cryogenic treatment chamber, a purpose-built listening room, and plans for 400 solar panels. Its flagship speaker used a proprietary coaxial driver called the ISO Flare. Mills was publicly clear that it was different than anything Tannoy ever did, carefully avoiding intellectual property conflict, while drawing on the same design philosophy that Rackham had established in 1947. Kevin Deal of US, distributor Upscale Audio, long one of Tannoy's most vocal American advocates, publicly switched his loyalty to Fine. Forum consensus on Pinkfish Media, AudioShark, and Audiogon was that Fine was the spiritual successor to Coatbridge-era Tannoy. The knowledge had walked out the door and built itself a new home 7 miles down the road. But Fine's survival punctuates the bleakness rather than relieving it. The best engineers Tannoy had in Scotland left because the parent company could no longer hold them. The knowledge was preserved. The institution was not. Back on Palace Craig Street, the end came quietly. In 2020, the site's landlord, Paloma Capital, entered pre-application consultation for a potential housing development on the footprint. 60 houses, a mix of family homes, starter homes and flats, with green space and a drainage pond. Music Tribe's Chris Hines, the company's product category leader, issued the statement that closed the book. With regret, the Coatbridge landlord announced their intention to repurpose the land and tear down the aging facility. We have decided to relocate manufacturing to another European facility, whilst also investing in our Manchester High-Tech Innovation Centre. We would like to pay our respects and thank all those affected for their incredible support and commitment. Paloma Capital's Director of Investment, Charles Lunnan, contradicted that framing within days. The Coatbridge site has always been industrial, and so we have started our search for a replacement tenant who can take up the space post-2023. In the meantime, we need to make sure we have all our bases covered, and if the market is such that we cannot find a new tenant, we have an alternative use in the form of housing. The lease still had 3 years to run, with a further option. The landlord wasn't tearing down the building. The landlord was looking for a new tenant. The decision to leave was Music Tribe's. The framing, the suggestion that the landlord had forced the company's hand, was a final act of narrative management from a company that had spent 4 years managing the narrative of a closure it had decided on in the first month of ownership. The factory ceased production around March 2021. The plant and equipment, the drilling machines, the veneer press, the crossover jigs, the acoustic test enclosures, the cryogenic chamber, decades of accumulated tooling, were auctioned by Sweeney Kincaid. Some of it was reportedly shipped east, some was broken up for scrap, some was bought by local specialist restorers who understood what they were looking at. Around the same time, Music Tribe made its entire international Tannoy sales force redundant. Nick Williams, Asia Pacific; Tim Gray, UK; Jay Cresswell, UK; Nick Bellis, Europe; Simon Godfrey, EMEA; John Norton, Global Hi-Fi. The Dubai Media City office, under Graham Lawton, was closed. Tannoy, the international sales organisation, the network of relationships and market knowledge that Tim Lount and his colleagues had spent decades building, ceased to exist. The Rosehall factory had stood for 45 years. The lights went out. Chapter 15. What the silence sounds like. 5 years on, the Coatbridge site is, perhaps surprisingly, still standing. It has not been demolished. Paloma Capital marketed the building through 2023 as a 69,000 square foot industrial unit, available for £275,000 a year, adjacent to the M8 motorway. The housing plan remains in reserve, Lunnan's backup, pending failure to find a commercial tenant. As of early 2026, no evidence has emerged that construction has begun. There is no memorial, no plaque, no heritage signage. Down in London, the original Norwood site was commemorated long ago as Tannoy Square SE27, a modest civic acknowledgement that something had been made there. In Coatbridge, there is nothing. Forum users on Pinkfish Media, in a kind of gallows humour, proposed that when the housing does arrive, the streets should be named after Tannoy models: Canterbury Avenue, Arden Close, Cheviot Way, Westminster Crescent. It's a joke. It's also the only memorial proposal anyone has made. A mile from where the factory sits empty is Summerley Museum of Scottish Industrial Life, a free admission heritage park built on the footprint of the old Summerley Ironworks, run by Culture NL, with a working tram, recreated miners' cottages, and an exhibition hall in the former Hydrocon crane factory, covering iron, coal, weaving and wartime industry. It is one of Scotland's most ambitious industrial heritage museums. It does not, on available evidence, contain a permanent Tannoy exhibit. A town whose economy was shaped for 45 years by one of the most internationally renowned audio manufacturers on Earth, appears to have failed to preserve the story in its principal museum. What is Tannoy today? It is, in essence, 3 things. First, a Chinese mass-market audio brand. The Mercury, Eclipse, Revolution XT and Gold Studio monitor lines are built in Zhongshan at volumes Coatbridge could never have matched, at prices Coatbridge could never have hit. Second, a small assembly operation in Hamilton, South Lanarkshire, 7 miles from the old Coatbridge factory. Tannoy's own 2024 press materials describe the sterling 3LZ Special Edition and the new SGM-10 Super Gold monitor as assembled in Tannoy's factory in Hamilton, Scotland. The word assembled rather than manufactured is the tell. Cabinets reportedly come from Poland. Drivers reportedly come from China. The Hamilton operation is a fraction of the scale and capability of what Coatbridge was. Third, an office in Manchester, the innovation centre Behringer named in 2016, staffed mostly by marketing and product management. Reviews of the current product are mixed. What Hi-Fi gave the sterling 3LZ Special Edition a critical 3-star review in 2024, describing it as tonally lean and short of natural warmth through the mid-range, with voices sounding thinner and harder than they should. Others have been kinder. The Westminster Royal GROW now retails for around $50,000 a pair. The Kingdom Royal Carbon Black Edition has been listed for over $100,000. In April 2023, Music Tribe appointed Symphony Distribution of Salisbury as Tannoy's UK superpartner distributor, a tacit admission that the mass redundancies of the international sales force in 2020 had destroyed the trade network that men like Tim Lount had spent decades building. Meanwhile, in the secondary market, the legacy of the Scottish and English factory eras has become a genuinely appreciating asset class. Aggregated data from Heifershark shows original 1960s autograph monitor gold 15-inch units selling at Japanese auction for between 4.5 and 5.5 million yen, roughly £23,000 to £29,000. GRF monitor gold. 15-inch units have reached 3.2 million yen. The forum consensus is consistent and blunt. Anything built in Coatbridge before 2016 is a collector's object. Anything built after is treated with suspicion. The value of the work that the Coatbridge workers did is rising. The workers themselves have been dispersed. The craft cannot be replicated, and the scarcity of the real thing is pushing prices upward year after year in auction rooms in Tokyo and on specialist resale forums across the world. Chapter 16. The Ghost in the Word. Let us be specific about what was lost, not in metaphor, in the language of the production floor. Lost. The capacity to build a 140-kilogram prestige cabinet from birch plywood and solid walnut to the tolerance of a concert piano. Lost. The quiet skill of a veneer specialist who could read the figure of a walnut log and lay up a Westminster's front baffle in matched burr so that a pair of speakers, standing side by side in a customer's listening room, looked as though they'd been carved from the same tree. Lost. The wiring knowledge of a crossover technician who knew which solder alloy to use on which capacitor lead to ensure the cryogenic treatment would relieve the metal lattice without cracking the joint. Lost. The hand-winding of dual concentric voice coils to a concentricity tolerance measured in hundredths of a millimeter. Lost. The acoustic intuition of a quality control engineer who could tell from the timbre of a single test tone whether a finished speaker had a fault that a spectrum analyzer might take another few seconds to flag. Lost. The network of suppliers who had grown up around the Coatbridge factory over 4 decades. The local timber merchants who knew what grade of Baltic birch Tannoy needed and when it needed it. The small engineering shops that machined bespoke fixings and brackets. The transport contractors who knew that a pallet of Westminsters was not the same thing as a pallet of bricks. Lost. The people. 70 of them at the 2016 announcement, their names largely unrecorded in the press. A dozen of them, Mills, O'Donoghue, Wilkinson, and a handful of others, partially preserved by fine audio. The rest dispersed to other jobs, other industries, other lives. Men and women whose families, in Coatbridge's multi-generational way, had worked at the same factory across 2 or 3 generations. A Tim Lount with 27 years, a Paul Mills with a quarter century, and behind them, the workers whose names never appeared in any press release or trade magazine. The woman who ran the router, the man who loaded the veneer press, the technician who soldered the crossover boards, whose expertise died as a transferable industrial capability the day the factory closed. This is the arithmetic of offshoring. It is invisible in the balance sheet because the balance sheet does not have a column for tacit craft. It records the fact that 70 wages paid in Lanarkshire have been replaced by wages paid in Guangdong. It does not record what was carried inside the heads and hands of the people who earned those wages. The Tannoy story is not an aberration. It is part of a pattern so deep that it barely registers as news anymore. Wharfdale, Quad. Mission, Leek, Celestian. Each one acquired, each one moved, each one reduced from a place where skilled people made specific things to a brand name applied to products assembled somewhere else. The list of British loudspeaker companies that still built most of their product in Britain grew shorter with each decade. Coatbridge's closure made it shorter still. Bowers and Wilkins in Worthing, Regger in Southend, Naim in Salisbury, Lynn in Glasgow, Fine in Glasgow. That is roughly what remains. A British train station, 2026. An announcement crackles through the public address system. The 1842 service to Glasgow Central is delayed by approximately 10 minutes. A few passengers glance up from their phones. Nobody thinks about Coatbridge. The word Tannoy is still in 2026, perhaps the most common trade name in the English language. It outlives the company that coined it. It will outlive the building that made the products it was coined for. A child born today in Glasgow or Selby or Dulwich will hear the word hundreds of times before they leave school, and none of them will know what it was. None of them will know about the Yorkshire man and the butcher's daughter, or the tantalum and the lead alloy, or the compression horn mounted behind a base cone, or the veneer specialist reading walnut grain in a factory in Lanarkshire, or the signed quality certificate tucked inside the cabinet alongside a tin of wax. Guy Rupert Fountain won the oldest game in marketing. He put his word into the common tongue. The word is immortal. The thing the word once named is not. The factory is empty. The workers are scattered. The craft is partially preserved in a company down the road. The brand is administered from Manila, manufactured in Zhongshan, assembled in small quantities in Hamilton. The last batch of Coatbridge-built Canterbury's are already appreciating on the secondary market in Tokyo. And some